April 11th, 1951. General Douglas MacArthur, five-star general, conqueror of Japan, American icon, is fired by President Harry Truman. The dismissal sends shockwaves through Washington, through Seoul, through Tokyo. MacArthur returns home to a hero's welcome. 7.5 million people line the streets of New York. Congress invites him to address a joint session. When he finishes his speech with those famous words, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," grown men weep openly in the chamber. But in the Pentagon, General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is preparing testimony that will challenge everything MacArthur stands for. In less than a month, Bradley will stand before Congress and deliver one of the most devastating critiques ever leveled at a military commander by a fellow general. He'll call MacArthur's plan to expand the Korean War into China the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. Those 17 words would define one of the greatest civil-military crises in American history. But here's what most people don't understand. This wasn't just about two generals disagreeing over strategy. This was about the future of American power, about whether the United States would fight a limited war or risk World War III, and about a fundamental question that still haunts us today. Who decides how America fights its wars? To understand why Bradley's words hit like a bombshell, you need to understand who these men were. Douglas MacArthur was 71 years old in 1951, and he'd spent 52 of those years in uniform. His father had been a Civil War hero and a general himself. MacArthur graduated first in his West Point class in 1903. He'd been the youngest division commander in World War I, superintendent of West Point, Army Chief of Staff. In World War II, he'd commanded the Southwest Pacific Theater, orchestrated the island-hopping campaign that brought America to Japan's doorstep, and accepted the Japanese surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri. After the war, he'd ruled Japan as supreme commander for the Allied powers, essentially functioning as an American shogun who remade Japanese society from the ground up. MacArthur didn't just have confidence. He had an almost mystical belief in his own destiny. He rarely used the word I. Instead, he referred to himself in the third person as MacArthur. He cultivated an image: the corncob pipe, the aviator sunglasses, the battered field marshal's cap. He gave interviews like he was delivering biblical prophecy. And he believed, genuinely believed, that he understood Asia in a way that Washington bureaucrats never could. Omar Bradley was different. Born in Missouri in 1893, he was 11 years younger than MacArthur, but looked older. A quiet, methodical man with wire-rimmed glasses and a face that looked like it belonged to a small-town schoolteacher, not a general. He'd graduated from West Point in 1915, in the same class as Dwight Eisenhower, the class the stars fell on, they called it, because so many became generals. Bradley had commanded the First Army in Normandy, had directed American forces through the Battle of the Bulge, had taken more than 1.3 million men across Germany in the final push of World War II. Eisenhower called him the GI's general. His men called him the soldier's general. He didn't grandstand. He didn't give soaring speeches. He just got the job done. When Truman made Bradley the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1949, he became the principal military advisor to the president. And in 1950, he became the only man ever to hold five-star rank in both the Army and as chairman. He was, on paper, MacArthur's superior, but MacArthur didn't see it that way. MacArthur reported directly to the president through the Joint Chiefs, but he'd spent 5 years in Tokyo operating with near total autonomy. He wasn't used to taking orders. He was used to giving them. And then, came Korea. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel with 135,000 troops, 150 T-34 tanks, and artillery that turned the South Korean army into a fleeing mass of refugees and scattered units. Within days, Seoul fell. Within weeks, South Korean and American forces were trapped in a shrinking perimeter around the port city of Busan, their backs to the sea. Truman ordered American intervention. MacArthur took command of United Nations forces in Korea, and on September 15, 1950, MacArthur pulled off one of the most audacious military moves in history, the amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city with 40-foot tides, treacherous mudflats, and terrible approaches. Navy planners called it impossible. MacArthur did it anyway. The landing cut North Korean supply lines in half. Within 2 weeks, Seoul was liberated. By October, UN forces were driving north toward the Chinese border. That's when everything changed. In October 1950, as MacArthur's forces pushed toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China, intelligence reports started coming in. Chinese troops were massing across the border in Manchuria. The numbers varied, but some estimates put the force at 300,000 men or more. On October 15th, Truman flew to Wake Island in the mid-Pacific to meet MacArthur personally. It was the only time the two men ever met face to face. According to the official record, Truman asked MacArthur about the chances of Chinese or Soviet intervention. MacArthur's response was unequivocal: very little. If the Chinese tried to cross into Korea, he said, they'd face the greatest slaughter in history. He had air superiority. He could destroy any Chinese force that dared to intervene. Bradley wasn't at Wake Island. He was in Washington, but he was reading the same intelligence MacArthur was ignoring, and the intelligence was troubling. On October 25th, Chinese volunteers, regular People's Liberation Army troops operating under a transparent fiction, attacked South Korean units near the Yalu. They vanished into the mountains after the engagement. A week later, they hit American units. Again, they disappeared. MacArthur dismissed these as minor actions. He pushed forward. On November 24th, Thanksgiving for the American troops, he launched what he called the Home by Christmas offensive. He told reporters the war would be over soon. The 8th Army would drive to the Yalu, link up with X Corps on the eastern side of the peninsula, and that would be that. 72 hours later, on November 27th, the Chinese attacked in force. Not 300,000 troops, not even 400,000. By the time the offensive was fully developed, the Chinese had committed somewhere between 450,000 and 500,000 men to Korea. They attacked at night, using bugles and whistles to coordinate movements, infiltrating between American positions, cutting off entire regiments. They moved on foot, carrying minimal supplies, living on rice and millet, surviving on determination and discipline that stunned American commanders. At the Chosin Reservoir, the 1st Marine Division found itself surrounded by 12 Chinese divisions. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero. The Marines fought their way out in a 17-day running battle that became legend, but they took 15,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or frostbite. The 8th Army in the West wasn't so lucky. They broke. Not everywhere, not all at once, but the retreat turned into a rout in some sectors. American units abandoned equipment, fell back in confusion. By mid-December, UN forces had been pushed back below the 38th parallel. Seoul fell again on January 4, 1951. It was the longest retreat in American military history. MacArthur was furious. He blamed Washington. He blamed restrictions placed on his command. Most of all, He blamed the decision not to strike China directly. Starting in late November and continuing through the winter, MacArthur bombarded Washington with requests, proposals, and barely disguised demands. He wanted four things. First, he wanted a naval blockade of China's coast, cut off their ports, starve their industry of raw materials and fuel, make them pay for intervening. Second, he wanted to bomb Chinese industrial centers and supply bases in Manchuria. The Chinese troops in Korea were supplied from depots across the Yalu River. American planes couldn't hit those depots under current rules of engagement. MacArthur wanted those rules changed. He wanted to destroy the Chinese logistics network at its source. Third, he wanted to use Chinese nationalist troops from Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang forces, which had fled to Taiwan after losing the Chinese Civil War in 1949. MacArthur proposed landing 50,000 to 60,000 nationalist troops on China's coast to open a second front. Let Chiang invade the mainland. Let the communists fight on two fronts. Fourth, and most controversially, MacArthur wanted authorization to use atomic weapons. He never put this in writing in explicit terms, but in conversations with visiting officials, in comments to reporters, he made it clear he was considering nuclear strikes on Chinese troop concentrations, on bridges across the Yalu, on logistics centers. In December, he submitted a list of targets that would require 26 atomic bombs to destroy. He told one visitor that atomic weapons could create a radioactive belt across Korea's northern border, a zone of contamination that would seal off Chinese reinforcement routes for decades. MacArthur framed his proposals as the only way to win the war. You can't fight with one hand tied behind your back, he argued. You can't allow the enemy sanctuary across an arbitrary border. War is war. If you're in it, you fight to win. Otherwise, you're just sacrificing American lives for nothing. In Washington, the reaction was mixed, but increasingly hostile. The Joint Chiefs of Staff considered MacArthur's proposals carefully. On paper, some of them had military merit. A blockade would hurt Chinese industry. Bombing Manchurian bases would disrupt Chinese logistics. And atomic weapons, well, the United States had used atomic weapons in 1945, and in 1950, America still had a nuclear monopoly. The Soviets had tested their first atomic bomb in August 1949, but they had only a handful of weapons and limited delivery capability. But the chiefs saw problems MacArthur either didn't see or didn't care about. A blockade would require British cooperation. Hong Kong was a British colony and a major transshipment point for Chinese trade. The British were opposed. They had billions of dollars in investments in Hong Kong and Asia. They thought MacArthur was reckless. And under the UN Charter, a blockade was an act of war. It would expand the conflict, not contain it. Bombing Manchuria raised even bigger concerns. Manchuria bordered the Soviet Union. Soviet advisors were operating Chinese air defenses. Soviet pilots might be flying some of those Chinese MiG-15s. If American bombers hit Soviet personnel or Soviet territory, even by accident, the USSR might invoke its mutual defense treaty with China. Stalin might not want World War III, but he might not have a choice if Soviet citizens were killed. The nationalist troops from Taiwan were worse than useless in the chief's view. Chiang's forces had lost the Chinese Civil War for a reason: poor leadership, low morale, corruption. Putting them on mainland China wouldn't open a second front. It would hand Mao Zedong a propaganda victory and possibly pull the entire Chinese population behind the communists in a patriotic war against foreign invasion. And atomic weapons? Bradley and the other chiefs looked at that option with cold calculation. Yes, atomic weapons could destroy Chinese troop concentrations, but China was huge. The Soviets might give China atomic weapons in retaliation. The Soviets might use atomic weapons in Europe, where American forces were outnumbered 10-1 by Soviet armies. And most importantly, using atomic weapons in Korea against non-white troops in an Asian country would alienate every neutral nation in the world. India opposed the war. So did many other newly independent nations. Dropping atomic bombs would confirm every communist propaganda claim that America was a racist imperialist power willing to commit genocide against colored people. The chiefs kept coming back to one central question: what is the strategic objective? MacArthur's answer was clear: destroy Chinese communist power, reunify Korea under a non-communist government, roll back communism in Asia. But that wasn't American policy. American policy, articulated by Truman, by Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and by the National Security Council, was containment. Stop communist expansion, but don't start World War III. Korea wasn't worth World War III. Nothing in Korea was worth risking Soviet atomic bombs falling on American cities. By March 1951, the military situation had stabilized. General Matthew Ridgway, who'd taken command of the 8th Army after General Walton Walker was killed in a Jeep accident in December, had stopped the Chinese offensive and launched a counterattack. American forces recaptured Seoul on March 14th. The front line was roughly back at the 38th parallel. The war had reached a stalemate, which, from Washington's perspective, was exactly the goal. On March 20th, the Joint Chiefs notified MacArthur that President Truman was preparing to announce a ceasefire proposal. The United Nations would seek negotiations with China and North Korea. The objective would be a return to the pre-war status quo: two Koreas divided at the 38th parallel, a demilitarized zone, international guarantees. It wasn't victory, it was compromise, but it would end the fighting and avoid escalation. MacArthur received that message on March 20th. 4 days later, on March 24th, he released his own statement to the press. In it, MacArthur essentially torpedoed Truman's peace initiative. He called the Chinese military performance inadequate. He said China lacked the industrial capacity to wage modern war. He demanded that the Chinese commander meet with him personally to discuss surrender terms, and he added a barely veiled threat: if the United Nations decided to expand the conflict beyond Korea, China would face military collapse. It was a calculated insult designed to make negotiations impossible. No Chinese leader could meet with MacArthur after being publicly humiliated. No negotiation could start when one side was demanding surrender. And MacArthur knew it. He was forcing Truman's hand. Either Truman backed MacArthur's approach, escalation, confrontation, possible nuclear war, or Truman would have to remove MacArthur from command. Truman was livid. According to his daughter Margaret, she'd never seen her father so angry. But Truman didn't act immediately. He consulted with his advisors, he consulted with the Joint Chiefs, and he waited for one more piece of evidence. It came on April 5th. Joseph Martin, the Republican minority leader in the House of Representatives, read a letter on the House floor. It was from MacArthur, responding to Martin's earlier letter. Martin had asked MacArthur's views on using Chinese nationalist troops in Korea. MacArthur's reply endorsed the idea and included this passage, quote, "We must win. There is no substitute for victory." That phrase, "there is no substitute for victory," became famous. But what made the letter devastating wasn't the phrase. It was the fact that MacArthur was conducting his own foreign policy, coordinating with opposition politicians to undermine the president's strategy. He was appealing over Truman to Ed directly to Congress and the American people. On April 9th, Truman met with Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and the Joint Chiefs, Bradley, General J. Lawton Collins, Admiral Forrest Sherman, and General Hoyt Vandenberg. Truman asked each man in turn, should MacArthur be relieved? All four chiefs said yes. Marshall said yes. Atchison said yes. It was unanimous. On April 11th, at 1 a.m. Washington time, the White House released the announcement. President Truman had relieved General MacArthur of all his commands. General Ridgway would take over in Korea. MacArthur was ordered to return to the United States. The public reaction was explosive. Truman's approval rating, already low, dropped to 22%, the lowest ever recorded for a sitting president to that point. Congressional offices were flooded with telegrams demanding Truman's impeachment. Newspapers ran editorials comparing Truman to Julius Caesar, firing a successful general. Senator Joseph McCarthy called it the greatest victory the communists have ever won. Senator William Jenner said the country was in the hands of a secret inner coterie which is directed by agents of the Soviet Union. MacArthur, meanwhile, was coming home. MacArthur landed in San Francisco on April 17, 1951. It was his first time on American soil in 14 years. A crowd estimated at 500,000 people greeted him. He spoke briefly at City Hall, invoking God and country, then flew to Washington. On April 19th, he addressed a joint session of Congress. The chamber was packed. Senators, representatives, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, everyone was there. The speech lasted 34 minutes. MacArthur defended his conduct. He explained his strategic vision. He argued that Asia, not Europe, was the real front in the struggle against communism. He dismissed the fear of Soviet intervention as exaggerated. He called for victory, not compromise. And he ended with those famous words, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye." The chamber erupted. Representatives wept openly. They applauded for 5 minutes. One congressman said it was the voice of God. Another called it the greatest speech in American history. 2 days later, MacArthur went to New York. 7.5 million people lined the streets for a ticker tape parade that dwarfed the celebrations for Eisenhower after World War II. 19 tons of paper fell from office buildings. MacArthur rode in an open car, standing, waving, soaking in the adulation. Congress scheduled hearings. The Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee would hold joint hearings on MacArthur's dismissal and on American policy in Korea and the Far East. The hearings would be closed to the press, but transcribed for eventual publication. They began on May 3, 1951. MacArthur testified first. He spoke for 3 days. 21 hours of testimony spread over 7 sessions. He repeated the arguments from his congressional address. He insisted his plans would work. He accused the administration of fighting a limited war with limited means for limited objectives, and he argued that was fundamentally wrong. Wars should be fought to win. Otherwise, you're just wasting lives. Republicans on the committee loved it. Democrats were more skeptical, but they couldn't shake MacArthur. He was confident, articulate, magnetic. Public opinion polls showed the American people supported him by wide margins. Then, on May 15th, Omar Bradley took the stand. Bradley was the 9th witness called. By the time he testified, the hearings had already heard from Secretary of Defense Marshall, Secretary of State Dean Atchison, and other senior officials. All had defended Truman's decision. But Bradley's testimony was different. Bradley was a soldier, not a politician. He wore his uniform. He spoke in clear, direct language. And he had credibility MacArthur couldn't match, because Bradley wasn't speaking for himself. He was speaking for the Joint Chiefs, for the collective military judgment of the United States Armed Forces. Bradley read a prepared statement. It was devastating. He began by defending Truman's right to fire MacArthur. The president is commander-in-chief. Military officers must follow orders or resign. MacArthur had repeatedly challenged presidential authority. That couldn't stand. Then Bradley turned to strategy. This is where he delivered the knockout blow. MacArthur's plan, Bradley said, rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of the global strategic situation. MacArthur wanted to focus on Asia. He wanted to blockade China, bomb Manchuria, fight the Chinese communists to the finish. But the real threat wasn't China. It was the Soviet Union. The Soviets had atomic weapons. The Soviets had a massive army in Europe, 175 divisions, according to estimates, against NATO's 14. The Soviets had submarines that could threaten American shipping, and the Soviets had a treaty with China. If the United States attacked China directly, the Soviets might intervene. That would mean World War III. MacArthur's plan would commit American resources to a land war in Asia, the worst possible strategic choice. It would drain troops, equipment, and supplies from Europe where they were needed to deter Soviet aggression. It would alienate allies, Britain, France, Canada, all of whom opposed expanding the Korean War, and it risked nuclear escalation that could kill millions. Then Bradley delivered the line that ended the debate. Red China is not the powerful nation seeking to dominate the world. Frankly, in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this strategy would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. The wrong war. The wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong enemy. It was a perfectly crafted phrase. It didn't attack MacArthur personally. It didn't question his courage or his record. It simply said, his judgment is wrong. His plan would lead to disaster, and the Joint Chiefs unanimously disagreed with him. Bradley went further. He explained that limited war was a new concept for Americans, but it was necessary in the nuclear age. Total war, the kind of war America had fought in World War II, was too dangerous now. Both sides had atomic weapons. Both sides could destroy each other's cities. That meant wars had to be fought for limited objectives, with limited means. Korea was a limited war. The goal was to stop communist aggression, not to destroy China. That might be frustrating. It might be unsatisfying. American soldiers might die in a war that didn't end in total victory. But the alternative, nuclear war, was unthinkable. Bradley testified for 4 days. He was calm, methodical, unshakable. When Republican senators tried to corner him, tried to get him to admit that MacArthur's plan might work, Bradley refused. He repeated the same points. MacArthur's plan was strategically unsound. It would weaken America's global position. It would risk World War III, and the Joint Chiefs opposed it. After Bradley testified, the other chiefs followed. Collins, Sherman, and Vandenberg all echoed Bradley's position. The uniformed military leadership was united against MacArthur. The hearings continued through June. By the time they ended, they'd heard from 13 witnesses and produced over 2 million words of testimony. When the transcripts were released, edited to remove classified information, they filled 2,250 pages. Public opinion shifted, slowly at first, then decisively. Bradley's testimony had changed the narrative. This wasn't about Truman firing a successful general. This was about civilian control of the military. This was about preventing World War III. Newspapers that had condemned Truman in April began running editorials supporting his decision by June. The New York Times wrote that Bradley had put the case for the administration's policy in Korea on solid ground. The Washington Post praised Bradley's devastating critique of MacArthur's strategy. MacArthur's support eroded, not among his hardcore admirers, they remained loyal, but among the broader public. A Gallup poll in May showed 66% of Americans thought Truman was wrong to fire MacArthur. By August, that number had dropped to 46%. MacArthur did fade away, though not quietly. He toured the country giving speeches. He flirted with running for president in 1952, but never formally entered the race. He settled in New York, took a job as chairman of the board of Remington Rand, and gradually receded from public life. He died in 1964 at age 84, still convinced he'd been right. Bradley served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff until August 1953. He retired from active duty, but remained a public figure, advising presidents on military matters until his death in 1981 at age 88. He never publicly criticized MacArthur again. He didn't need to. The hearings had spoken for him. The Korean War dragged on for 2 more years. Negotiations started in July 1951 and continued while fighting raged along the 38th parallel. An armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953. The border between North and South Korea remained essentially where it had been in 1950. No victory, no defeat, just stalemate. American casualties, 36,574 killed in action, 103,228 wounded, 4,714 missing, 7,800 prisoners of war. Chinese casualties, estimates range from 400,000 to 600,000 killed and wounded. No one knows the precise figure. North Korean casualties, probably 500,000 or more. South Korean military and civilian casualties, over 2 million. For what? A return to the status quo. 2 Koreas, still divided, still hostile, still heavily armed. Bradley's phrase, "the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy," became one of the most quoted lines in American military history. It defined the debate over limited war. It established the precedent that military commanders must subordinate their judgment to civilian leadership. And it marked the end of an era. MacArthur represented the old way of thinking. War is total. Victory is absolute. America's enemies must be crushed. That approach had worked in World War II, when America's industrial power was unmatched and atomic weapons were an American monopoly. But by 1951, the world had changed. The Soviets had atomic weapons. America had global commitments. NATO had to be defended. Allies had to be consulted. And the risk of nuclear war imposed limits that couldn't be ignored. Bradley understood that. So did Truman. So did the other chiefs. MacArthur never did. He believed in his gut that America could win any war it chose to fight. He believed that showing weakness invited aggression. He believed that limited war was a contradiction in terms. War is war. You fight to win or you don't fight at all. That debate didn't end in 1951. It echoed through Vietnam, where American commanders fought a limited war with limited means and growing frustration. It echoed through Iraq and Afghanistan, where American forces won every battle but struggled to define victory. It echoes today in every debate over whether America should intervene militarily, and if so, with what objectives, what resources, what exit strategy. The question Bradley and MacArthur argued about remains unanswered. How do you fight a war you're not willing to lose but not allowed to win? MacArthur's answer was, you change the rules, you escalate, you do whatever it takes to win. Bradley's answer was, you accept that some wars can't be won in the traditional sense. You fight for limited objectives. You prevent worse outcomes. You avoid World War III. History vindicated Bradley. The Korean War didn't expand into China. The Soviets didn't intervene. Nuclear weapons weren't used. World War III didn't happen. But MacArthur's ghost never left. Every time America fights a limited war, every time politicians impose restrictions on military commanders, MacArthur's argument resurfaces. If you're not willing to do whatever it takes to win, why are you sending soldiers to die? It's a powerful argument. It resonates emotionally. But Bradley had the better answer, because the alternative is worse. What often gets lost in the strategic arguments is the personal dimension. These were two men who'd spent their entire adult lives in uniform. They'd both commanded hundreds of thousands of troops in combat. They both made life and death decisions. They both loved their country. And they hated each other. Not publicly, both were too professional for that. But the contempt was mutual and deep. MacArthur thought Bradley was a bureaucrat, a politician in uniform, a man who'd never understood Asia and never would. MacArthur believed he had a special understanding of the Asian mind, a belief that was patronizing at best and racist at worst, but genuinely held. He thought Washington was sacrificing victory because of timidity and political calculation. Bradley thought MacArthur was a prima donna, a showboat, a commander who'd lost touch with reality. Bradley had seen MacArthur's intelligence summaries in late 1950 before the Chinese intervention. MacArthur had consistently downplayed evidence of Chinese involvement, dismissed warnings, and overestimated American capabilities. That wasn't strategy, that was arrogance. There's an incident that captures the gulf between them. In January 1951, Bradley flew to Tokyo to meet with MacArthur personally. The meeting was tense. MacArthur lectured Bradley on Asian politics for over an hour. He barely let Bradley speak. When Bradley tried to explain Washington's concerns about escalation, MacArthur cut him off. "You don't understand. The Oriental mind respects strength. Show weakness, and they'll exploit it." Bradley later told an aide that MacArthur had the patience of a corporal and the vision of a general, but only for his own theater. MacArthur, for his part, reportedly told his staff that Bradley was a clerk in uniform. The tragedy is that both men had legitimate points. MacArthur was right that fighting a limited war is frustrating and costly. He was right that restricting American military power gave the enemy advantages. He was right that American soldiers were dying while their commanders' hands were tied by political considerations. Bradley was right that those political considerations mattered. He was right that expanding the war risked catastrophe. He was right that America's allies had to be consulted and that global strategy trumped theater strategy. But neither man could admit the other had a point. The debate became personal, became about pride and ego and legacy. And that's often how the biggest strategic arguments work. They start as questions of policy and end as battles of personality. Here's the part that usually gets forgotten. Bradley wasn't just thinking about Korea. He was thinking about Europe. In May 1951, while the hearings were happening, the Joint Chiefs were conducting war games, simulating a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The results were classified, but they were terrifying. NATO couldn't stop a Soviet conventional attack. The only option was nuclear weapons, lots of them, tactical nukes, strategic nukes, whatever it took to slow the Soviet advance until American reinforcements arrived. But those reinforcements depended on having troops available. And if America committed to a land war in China, as MacArthur wanted, those troops wouldn't be available. They'd be fighting in Asia while Europe fell. That's what Bradley meant by the wrong enemy. China was dangerous, sure, but China couldn't invade Western Europe. China couldn't launch a nuclear strike on New York City. China couldn't threaten NATO. The Soviet Union could. And here's the revelation that Bradley understood, but MacArthur refused to accept. Stalin wanted America bogged down in Asia. Every division fighting in Korea was a division not defending Europe. Every plane bombing China was a plane not deterring the Soviets. Every ship blockading Chinese ports was a ship not protecting Atlantic convoys. MacArthur's plan played directly into Stalin's hands. It would have given the Soviets a free hand in Europe, while America bled itself dry fighting China, a country that in 1951 had almost no navy, no strategic air force, and no ability to threaten American interests outside Asia. That's why Bradley's testimony was so devastating. He wasn't just saying MacArthur was wrong. He was saying MacArthur was playing the fool in Stalin's game. The wrong enemy, the wrong place, the wrong time. And the worst point? MacArthur probably never understood it. He died believing Washington had betrayed him, that timid politicians had thrown away victory, that history would vindicate his vision. History did no such thing. 73 years after Bradley spoke those words, they still define the limits of American military power. Every president since Truman has faced the same question. How far are we willing to go? What risks are we willing to take? When does strategic advantage become strategic recklessness? MacArthur wanted total victory. Bradley wanted to avoid total war. In 1951, Bradley won the argument. Whether he was right, whether limited war is sustainable, whether America can fight wars it's not willing to win, those questions remain open. So here's my question for you. In an age of nuclear weapons, global terrorism, and great power competition, is Bradley's doctrine of limited war still viable? Or was MacArthur right that there's no substitute for victory? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you found this deep dive into one of the most important civil-military crises in American history valuable, consider subscribing. There's a lot more where this came from.